Let me start with something simple, something so ordinary you've probably never stopped to question it. You have a birth certificate. Your parents have one. Your grandparents most likely do too. And for most of us, that document feels as natural as breathing. It is treated as proof that you exist, proof that you matter, and proof that the world acknowledges you were born. We carry it to the DMV, to the passport office, and to the Social Security Administration. We treat it like an absolute birthright. But here's the thing. For the vast majority of human history, through thousands of years of complex civilization, empire, conquest, trade, and governance, nobody needed one. Not a single soul. And then, within the span of roughly 2 decades at the turn of the 20th century, nearly every industrialized nation on Earth decided that they did. All of them moved simultaneously, as if following instructions they didn't fully understand. That is where we have to start asking questions. If we go back, not to some primitive, chaotic world, but to a world that functioned remarkably well in many respects without state-issued identity documents for individual citizens, we see a completely different landscape. Ancient Rome cataloged its citizens, but that was census data, household data, and property data. The household mattered, the family unit mattered, but not the individual body. Not the individual breath, and not the specific moment of emergence into the world as a time-stamped, numbered event. Moving forward, medieval Europe relied heavily on parish records. These were church records kept by local clergy tracking baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Crucially, these were not government instruments, they were ecclesiastical ones. The church knew you existed, the state largely trusted the church's accounting, and you didn't carry these documents around with you. You were never required to produce them just to function in daily society. This raises a simple but critical question. If enormous civilizations like the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the British Empire at its height could manage millions of people without issuing each one a numbered identity document at birth, what changed? What exactly did the modern state suddenly need to know that it hadn't needed to know for millennia before? The deeper we look into this question, the more the standard historical answers start to feel incomplete. We are told by mainstream history textbooks that it was all about public health, tracking infant mortality, understanding disease patterns, and improving maternal care. Yes, those things happened, and those motivations are real, but they completely fail to explain the sheer scope of what was actually built. They don't explain why a massive infrastructure that followed quickly became the absolute foundational credential of legal personhood in the modern world. That is where the official explanation begins to collapse. In the United States, the federal push for standardized birth registration began in earnest around 1902 when the Census Bureau established a birth registration area. It began as a voluntary system where states that could demonstrate a 90% registration rate would be officially recognized as compliant. By 1915, 10 states and the District of Columbia were in this area. By 1933, just 31 years later, every single state in the Union had joined. Think about that time frame. It took just 31 years for the entire country to completely restructure how it accounted for every single human being born within its borders. Now consider what else was happening in those exact same 31 years. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The federal income tax was raised through the 16th Amendment, also in 1913. Social Security would soon arrive in 1935, requiring a verifiable record of birth. The draft registration of World War I in 1917 required rigorous documentation of age and citizenship. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, the birth certificate quietly became the master key, the root document from which all other legal identity would grow. This was not a coincidence, not an accident, and not simply the natural evolution of a caring, progressive society. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the globe. And here is the strangest part. It wasn't just America. Britain's General Register Office, established in 1837, began mandatory civil registration of births, but it took until the early 20th century for enforcement mechanisms to give those records real legal teeth. France, Germany, Australia, and Canada were all moving within the exact same compressed historical window toward the exact same system. Different nations, different governments, and different languages, but the exact same administrative architecture emerged, as if they were all reading from the same hidden blueprint. To understand why this matters, we have to look at a concept in legal theory that most people find either fascinating or deeply unsettling. There is a critical, foundational distinction between a person and a human being. In ordinary language, those words sound like perfect synonyms, but in the architecture of law, they are not the same thing at all. A human being is a biological fact. You are born, you breathe, you exist. That is not a legal determination, that is simply reality. A person, however, in the strict legal sense, is an artificial entity recognized by the state as having rights, responsibilities, and crucially, obligations. Corporations are legal persons. Municipalities are legal persons. The word itself comes from the Latin persona, meaning the mask worn by actors in Roman theater, the face presented to the public, the role played within a system. What the birth certificate appears to do, and what it seems designed to do at its core, is create that legal person at the exact moment of registration. A record is generated, an entry is made in a ledger, a numbered document is stamped, and that document doesn't just describe you in the eyes of the state. In a functional sense, it constitutes you, or at least it constitutes the version of you that the government is authorized to interact with. Let us look closely at what a birth certificate actually makes possible in the real world rather than what we are told it makes possible. We are told it provides a sense of identity, a connection to heritage, or a record of our origins. But what it structurally enables is something else entirely. First, it enables precise taxation. It moves beyond the crude sense of the government simply knowing you exist and into an administered system of assigning you a taxpayer identification. In the modern world, the Social Security number required at birth flows directly from birth registration. That number is how the tax authority knows to come looking for you, not for your father's household, not for your family's land, but for you as an individual economic unit. Second, it enables mass conscription. When governments needed to draft millions of men into the world wars, they needed verifiable records of age. Birth certificates made that possible at scale. You could not previously have managed that kind of mass mobilization with parish records scattered across private church archives in a dozen different languages. Third, it enables total tracking. You are who you are, what name you carry, and what status you hold because of it. Marriage records link to birth records, death records close the loop, and property records tie back to identity documents that trace their route directly to birth registration. The birth certificate isn't a celebration of a life. It appears to be the opening entry in a ledger that will follow that life from its very first breath to its last. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. There is one more thread we cannot leave hanging because once you understand that the birth certificate creates a legal entity, a mask the state interacts with, a darker question surfaces. It is a question that legal researchers have argued about in obscure journals for decades, mostly ignored and occasionally mocked. What if the document doesn't just represent you to the state? What if it securitizes you? When modern governments issue bonds and borrow against future productivity, future tax revenue, and future economic output, they need collateral. They need something real that will, with reasonable certainty, generate value over time. In the early 20th century, precisely when birth registration systems were being universalized, governments were also expanding their capacity to borrow massively, backed by the projected economic productivity of their populations. Is the registered citizen, the legal person, the numbered entity, functioning in some structural sense as that collateral? Not the human being, not the breathing, living person, but the legal fiction attached to them at birth. The evidence suggests the question is highly worth asking because the registration, the numbering, the bonding, the taxation, and the debt all evolved in near-perfect parallel, building decade by decade into an interlocking global system. What troubles me most is something subtle. When systems this massive are built, there is usually a visible transition period, a time when the old way and the new way coexist, when people fiercely debate the merits, when newspapers run editorials, and when philosophers, lawyers, and citizens argue about what it means to register a human life with the government as though it were a deed of property or a corporate filing. If you look for that debate, if you look for the deep philosophical reckoning or the public conversation about what it meant to hand the state the authority to record your child's existence as a numbered entry in a government ledger, you will find that the silence is deafening. There were plenty of public health advocates and statisticians writing about practical benefits, but the deeper philosophical question about what it means to convert a living human being into a state-recognized legal entity went entirely unasked in the mainstream discourse of the era. Why was it ignored? Why did the architects of these systems not feel the need to justify this profound aspect of what they were building? Why did the framing stay so relentlessly practical, focused on infant mortality and demographic data, when the infrastructure being constructed was so much larger than any of those justifications required? Something much larger was being assembled, for which the public health rationale was at minimum only a partial explanation. This brings us to the core issue, the coordination problem. This is the most intellectually difficult aspect of what we are looking at. It is not just the existence of birth certificates or the expansion of the state's administrative reach, but the total simultaneity of it all. Nation after nation, representing entirely different histories, different legal traditions, different languages, and different governments, some monarchies, some republics, some in the middle of revolutionary upheaval, all arrived at essentially the exact same administrative architecture within the exact same compressed historical window. The logic of it is entirely identical, the individual as the unit of administration, the birth event as the initiating moment, the document as the legal anchor of identity, and the number as the administrative handle. These are not ideas that completely different societies would naturally invent independently and arrive at simultaneously. These are ideas that were intentionally spread and shared. Through what channels? Under whose guidance? Driven by whose overarching vision of how a modern society should account for its human beings? Those questions don't have clean, comfortable answers, but the official explanations simply do not account for the speed, the global synchronization, or the total absence of any serious, sustained pushback against what was, in retrospect, a profound restructuring of the human experience. Before we close, we have to ask what was replaced. In the world before registration, before the numbered document, and before the administrative ledger, how did people understand their relationship to their community, to the land, and to the broader social fabric? The parish records, the household censuses, the ancient clan structures, and the community-level forms of recognition were certainly not perfect. They were often exclusionary and often manipulated by local powers, but they operated on a completely different principle. They were, at their root, deeply relational and communal instruments. The community knew you existed. The church community, the village community, the extended family. Your presence in the world was acknowledged through relationship and through belonging, not through central registration. What the birth certificate replaced, or at minimum dramatically restructured, was that relational form of recognition. It successfully substituted a state relationship for a communal relationship. You were real now, not because your community knew your face, but because the government had recorded your number. That is a profound psychological and cultural shift, and it happened so quickly and so smoothly that most people alive today have absolutely no memory of any other way of being recognized in the world. This story does not end in the past. It extends directly forward into Social Security numbers issued at birth, into the digital identity systems being assembled right now, and into the fundamental question of what it means when the primary document proving your existence is held ultimately not by you, but by the state that issued it. The most important questions remain open. Why, in the span of a single generation, did every industrialized nation build the exact same tracking system? Who truly decided that the individual human being, rather than the household, the community, or the family, should be the fundamental unit of state administration? What was the experience of selfhood like before your existence was a numbered entry in a government archive? None of us were ever asked whether we wanted to be registered. You were enrolled in this system before you could speak, before you could think, and long before you could consent or object. The document that proves your legal existence, the one you need to get a driver's license, a passport, a bank account, a job, or a mortgage, was not created for you. It was created about you. There is a massive difference, and the deeper we look, the more it becomes clear that this difference matters. Someone understood exactly what they were building, and the rest of us were never meant to notice.